Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, a gathering place for fellow fiends the world over to discuss all things freaky and frightening. If you want to be part of the conversation, and I hope you do, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, maybe go back and check out some of our previous episodes, leave a comment, and most importantly, let us know the fright flicks you'd like to discuss in the future. That kind of connection is exactly what we're looking for, and it really does make a difference. We're all about sharing the scare, and we want to hear from you. In 1963, director Mario Bava made The Girl Who Knew Too Much and gave birth to the Italian film genre known as the Giallo. Named after a series of crime paperbacks with yellow covers, the Giallo was boldly contemporary, eschewing the cloaks and capes of Amer's Gothic melodramas. A year later, Bava made the film that would define and popularize the Giallo for years to come, Blood and Black Lace. Set in a large fashion house in Rome, the story contains all the trappings of a classic whodunit, with a series of murders, multiple suspects, and a secret-filled diary, but the plot is nothing more than a thread for Bava to string his pearls of exquisitely crafted, colorful, imaginative, and violent set pieces. Instead of being repelled by the horrific images, viewers are seduced by their visual bravado and panache. With shadowy rooms filled with flashing red and green lights, blue fog rolling through the exteriors, and every drop and smear of blood meticulously dabbed onto the moving canvas. 45 years later, Belgian husband and wife filmmaking team Bruno Forzani and Helene Cattet created a stunning tribute to Bava and his brethren with their 2009 feature film debut, Amer, a three-pronged examination of a young woman's life, shot through the Italian horror lens. And like their forerunners, the story and deeper meanings seem almost secondary, heavily masked, like a black-gloved killer waiting for the right moment to strike. Tonight we examine these two singular examples of visual storytelling, defying such easy dismissals as style over substance, recognizing that style is in fact substantial, and murder in the right hands can be magic. I'm very excited to talk about these two extraordinary exercises in style, and I've got an awesome panel to chat about them with me, so I'm going to bring everybody in, and let's say hello to Nicola McCafferty, coming in from Chicago.
Hello.
Barry Kaufman, also from Chicago.
Greetings.
Rounding out our Chicago triumvirate, Jason Kaufman.
Hello.
Chris Scales, beaming in from Colorado.
Hello, everyone.
And last but not least, beaming in from places unknown with a face no one has ever seen, our mystery man. Do you have a voice modulator as well?
I do.
And we're going to be chatting about Blood and Black Lace from 1964, celebrating its 60th anniversary, and from Belgium, Amer from 2009, celebrating its 15th anniversary. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. Okay, so let's dive in here. 1964, we see Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, and it basically becomes the archetype for what will be known as the Giallo subgenre. It wasn't the first Giallo he had done. It wasn't the first Giallo ever made, but he also set the template in that regard because he did The Girl Who Knew Too Much the year before, 1963. Nicola, would you mind giving us a little brief introduction to Blood and Black Lace?
Yeah, Blood and Black Lace is this fantastic film set in the world of a Roman fashion house. And it's very proto-slasher in the way that we see a lot of beautiful women being killed for their sins, and kind of a conspiratorial plot. And it's beautiful. It's a wash in color. The score is amazing. It's one of my favorite films of all time.
Awesome. Thank you. Barry, how about you? What was your introduction to this film and Mario Bava in general?
I saw this film when I was 12 years old at the Homewood Theater in the south suburbs of Chicago. It was a revival house, small revival house, run by a great guy named Sanford Cohn, who recently passed away, unfortunately. But he would show three different double features every week, and one of them almost was always horror. And he showed Blood and Black Lace with Horror Castle, version of Nuremberg. You know, I was interested in filmmaking at the time, so I was immediately taken, of course, by the use of color and motion and all these things. And I realized how much you could do, obviously Mario Bava did, how much you can do with just color, camera motion, and moving the impulse of the narrative forward just by that alone, and not even with dialogue, not even with exposition. I think films today rely on that far too much. But at that time, I realized it was almost like a silent film, and that these changes in tone and color really drove the narrative and kind of built this tension up to these releases. And then it would sort of start over again. And I thought that was fascinating. I realized this guy is like a film magician. And then I started really getting into his movies, and every one of them, well, they changed in tone a little bit after his director of photography. He left him in 1966, and his films changed a little bit in terms of their visual style, but still they always had that same like Bava touch, where he used the camera and used lighting and tone in such a way that it was a language of its own. And I just appreciated that so much in his work.
Yeah. Well, he was a big fan of Hitchcock. I mean, The Girl Who Knew Too Much obviously is a play on The Man Who Knew Too Much. Jason, let's go ahead and jump down to you. What was your introduction to Mario Bava? And do you remember seeing this film for the first time?
I'm not sure when I first saw it. I think the first Bava that I saw that I actually associated with him was Hercules in the Haunted World. I got these old, long ago Anchor Bay DVD sets that had a bunch of, like, there were two different ones with 4 movies each. And Blood and Black Lace is not in either of them. So I'm not sure how I first ended up seeing it, but eventually I ended up tracking it down on DVD and was just completely floored. Like all of his movies, like his early stuff especially.
I was talking on a previous show about like how many more upgrades do we need? We have DVD and then Blu-ray and then UHD, and it's like, what do we? But with Mario Bava's work, I'm like, yes, keep going, keep pushing, because every single upgrade, it just becomes more and more of an extraordinary experience.
We watched the Arrow Blu-ray from 2015, which is almost 10 years old now, but it's still, it still looks
amazing.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Chris, how about you? What's your Bava and or Blood and Black Lace story?
So I would say Blood and Black Lace was about the third or fourth Bava film that I saw after Bay of Blood, after Black Sunday, and Black Sabbath. And I know that you and I met on the old IMDb boards, Doc, but we used to have this really long list of, it was like the top 500 movies that our people used to vote on. And I finally came to the part in the list where I got to Blood and Black Lace. And I wondered where I was going to pick it up from because I couldn't find it anywhere. Luckily, Netflix still had DVDs being rented out at the time. So I rented the DVD from there. And to be honest, maybe even as much as Suspiria, Blood and Black Lace really cemented my love for the Giallo subgenre. As you can probably tell from the color of my wall behind me, that's really what influenced me to put that color in my house. But yeah, it was just everything from how you're just grabbed by the music as soon as it starts, that really sultry, jazzy sounding opening theme, and the mannequins being posed there in red, and kind of the stars kind of giving a slight spoiler, at least the female ones, as to how they're going to they're going to die later. But yeah, just everything about it just cemented why I love the Giallo subgenre and why I'm still such a big fan of it today. And it's a timeless classic in my opinion.
Well, it's funny you mentioned those 3 films, Black Sunday, Black Sabbath, and Bay of Blood, because I feel like those are like 3 very distinct entry points into the world of Mario Bava, because you've got the Gothic from Black Sunday, you've got the color Gothic for Black Sabbath, and also if you're into, anthologies. And then you got Bay of Blood, which is kind of like the slasher point entry. So yeah, he was a master stylist and did not limit himself to one subgenre of the horror, but he also did a ton of other stuff as well, not just horror and thriller. And let's jump over to our mystery man. Do you have an origin story that you'd like to share that won't reveal your deep and dark past?
I believe I can do that. I used to live in a place where there was this very nice company called Exhumed Films. And Exhumed Films would do, maybe once a month, they would do a double feature. They would do these, what they called Bava Argento double features where they would pair up a Mario Bava film with an Argento film. So you'd show the Black Sabbath and match that up with Inferno, Kill Baby Kill with Deep Red. And obviously those films made a deep impression on me. When I moved to the place where I am now, there were two very well stocked video stores still in operation renting out movies. And between them, they had pretty much every Mario Bava film imaginable.
Thank you. Nicola, I want to bounce back to you because you actually said, if you ever do a panel on Blood and Black Lace, I was like, I'm actually thinking about doing one next year. What is it that drew you to this film in particular?
Yeah, this is a film that I've written about a few times. So I'm a PhD candidate, and my research is on non-human women, and mannequins are a big part of that. So I think just the presence of all of the mannequins and the kind of, they're not, an active part of the story, but they're doing a lot of like psychological work in the film, especially with Chris mentioned the opening credits. Are just brilliant and really sort of set the stage for the kind of psychosexual dynamics that are going to be happening there. And they're just such visually striking blood red mannequins, the likes of which I've never really seen before. So that's like the big appeal for me. But this is also one of the first gialli that I ever saw. And for me, it's really got everything that I could want from the genre. We have, a fashion house that's a den of sin. We have a lot of beautiful women, beautiful colors, mannequins. The repeated mention of sex maniac. It's really got everything in spades.
We didn't actually get to your origin story in terms of how you came to this film. Was it just the mannequins, or did you know about it and kind of tied it in?
I think that there was this is when I was living in Boston, and I think that there was like some sort of big Giallo programming happening. I know I saw the bird with the crystal plumage there, but I think just sort of as part of my introduction to Italian horror, I just investigated this and I watched Bay of Blood and Blood and Black Lace around the same time. And now my kind of unsung other favorite is Hatchet for the Honeymoon, which I found a VHS tape of a few years ago. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure how I came to it.
That's okay. That beautiful wash of Bava was lovely to hear. Jason and I actually watched this the other night together. It's such a stunning looking film. And that is something that all of Bava's films really have in spades, is the visuals. We did a panel on Black Sabbath last year, and we talked about how like pretty much you could freeze frame any moment and then just frame that on your wall. And I feel like that is so true. We've talked a couple times about the opening sequence, kind of that introduction. It's almost like a curtain call in reverse, where we're being introduced to these various characters with different colors, and some of them look frozen and some of them like have like a quick eye movement up to the camera.
It just does a great job just setting the tone for the entire piece. And I think the only thing it doesn't really prepare you for, especially back then in 1964, the murders and how pretty graphic those murders were for 1964.
If I might add, if it's okay, I think also Mario Bava had a sense of humor. Was very self-reflexive about cinema, at like the ending of Black Sabbath, for example, the little reveal in the Italian version. And I think this was also playing upon, it seemed to me, the formality of the fashion house setting. Like setting that up, like this was a fashion house, and here's these people in this very elaborate setting, this very Baroque setting, all sitting there like this, kind of statuesque, almost like a lot of the statues in the film, but also sort of posing for their fashion moment before many of them are slaughtered, which I think is sort of his sense of humor,
Yeah. And I think there's a heightened quality as well. Like there's an artifice to it. Yeah. And I think that also allows us to kind of get in that mindset that this is not necessarily going to be a realistic or naturalistic film. This is going to be one where it is about the visuals. It is about the style. And we get that right from the get-go.
The other great thing about having the mannequins in the opening sequence is that every time you see one of the mannequins in the film proper, it's almost like they're bearing witness to what's happening. They're the unspeaking witnesses who they see all, but they can't say anything. The other thing I love about the Arrow Blu-ray, which I watched this week again, is when you just leave that title screen on and it just
Yep.
loops over and over again.
That loop of the introduction and that great Carlos Rustichelli score. Somebody described it as like a trashy jazz, and I'm like, that's great. That's a great descriptor for it, because it feels dirty, it feels naughty, it feels kind of like something you want to get into.
I always thought of the opening credit sequence as kind of like a flex, because it's so good and like it's amazing, and then the movie actually like
It lives up to it.
delivers. Yeah, it actually delivers on that.
Everything is heightened. That score is heightened. The lighting is heightened. Everybody's quality is heightened. But then, as Nicola pointed out, then we get into the meat of the matters, which is that we're at this, fashion house, and one of our models is murdered right in the opening sequence. As you said, Chris, like I was watching the actress getting just really thrown around. I hadn't remembered like just how kind of vicious all these murders are.
In all of these cases, this is not an experienced killer. This is not somebody who's done this a lot. So these are very sloppy murders. These are murders that have often case improvised in the moment. Oh, here's a weapon, I can use this.
Right. That's a great point, actually. And let's go ahead and throw the spoilers banner up so that we can talk about some of these exquisite, and I'm going to use that word very intentionally, exquisite murders, because they are gorgeously and meticulously created for the camera. So we have that first murder, which is out in the woods, and that's our first reveal of the killer with the white cloth mask. So it's featureless. I read somewhere that, like that feels Michael Myers-ish for a new generation, which I'm kind of like, I love that those touchstones just kind of move their way through history.
One of the other things, and I know we're going to get into more of the death scenes later, is every time I watch the movie, I try my hardest, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying regarding the featureless mask that they're wearing, is, now that we're in spoiler territory, you can't really decipher, unless you really go through their actions, which one of the killers is actually doing the killing. You can't really tell if it's the character played by Ava Bartok or if it's the character played by Cameron Mitchell. I love how that still throws that mystery in there. And when it gets to that twist, you're just like, okay, now which one did what?
Barry, if you don't mind, I realize that we should probably do a little bit of like groundwork in terms of what is Giallo, because this is the first Gialli we've covered on the show.
Except for the telephone.
Well, sure. And that is very much a proto Giallo.
And there is a telephone at the end of this film.
There sure is. And they're all very ornately colored in.
Right. Blood and Black Lace, like you mentioned, Girl Who Knew Too Much, which is like certainly the first official Giallo, but that's a little more comical. And certainly I think the use of color and the setting in this film of the fashion industry and the Baroque and elaborate settings, it brings together the aesthetic luxury in Giallo, the best Giallo, I think. The eroticism of it is definitely there. And I love this film because it is erotic in a particular way, but doesn't need to be explicit, certainly, but it still gets that across in like the movement of the camera, the lushness of the settings, the glamour of the women, and the combination of truly shocking murder, in Giallo, because I think that's obviously a trademark of the Giallo cinema is the shocking murder, but I love it in this film. And I think the films of Sergio Martino, I think he qualifies, Emilio Miraglia, they all understand the contrast of really shocking murder with this aesthetic luxury, these beautiful, glamorous settings, whether they're more like pop, like postmodern settings of Miraglia or more Baroque settings, many times of a Bava film. That contrast is so essential to a really good Giallo, and also the driving forward of the narrative using those elements. I think people a lot of times say, oh, the plots are flimsy like Blood and Black Lace. When I first experienced Blood and Black Lace, I didn't think the plot was flimsy at all. I thought it was actually pretty ingenious and very complex. And yeah, there was a reveal earlier in the film than many Giallos would have, which I thought was interesting. And then that kind of went in a different direction. after things were revealed, you got into the killer's minds. And I thought that was actually pretty fascinating too. But I don't think the plots are as flimsy as in a film like this. The plot is subservient to what you're seeing. The plot is subservient to the visual. So it does take a back seat. It's kind of like, as a sidebar, just briefly, like what people say about the early Godzilla films. You can't help it because the visuals are so spectacular. And Bava has such a mastery of multi-layering and all these techniques that you're just blown away by that. So the plot seems to take a second tier, but once you actually get into that plot, I think in the best Giallo, and I think Sergio Martino has this as well, plot is driven forward by these elements, and that's why I think this is such a stunning Giallo. And I don't know what other panelists think, but I think that's what establishes Giallo for me.
Another thing that we must discuss when talking about the origins of the Giallo is the German Krimi films that started in 1959 with Fellowship of the Frog, that were done by a company called Rialto Films, and they ran for a good 15 years. They were all based on the works of Edgar Wallace. Many of them featured killers who wore masks or other disguises. They started out in black and white and then switched to color in the mid-60s. So it was after Blood and Black Lace that the Krimi switched to color, which was, I think, a very important turning point for that film. So you had very convoluted plots. You had an heiress who's trying to be bilked out of her estate that she's just inherited. You have people who are searching for lost treasure. You have all these very clear motives for the murders, and it's usually based on money or some kind of bequest that people want to claim as their own. And I think when you get to something like Blood and Black Lace, what is the motive? Everybody has a motive. Everybody has some secret that they need to stay a secret. So once this diary is introduced into the film, and I love the introduction of the diary because you get these quick cuts of all these people who they know what's in that diary, and they would kill to prevent that from coming out.
Right. Or they're worried about what might be in the diary. This person who might have something to say about them. Everybody feels like, as you said, everybody has a motive. Everybody also has a secret sin that they're carrying around with them, and they don't want it revealed. And I think what you just talked about, that diary, like that becomes such a great set piece because once it's introduced, it goes very Hitchcockian in that it becomes all about that it, where it goes, who's watching it. Jason and I were like laughing out loud kind of at the audaciousness of it. Like it makes no bones about, yep, this is all about keep your eye on the bag.
In the foreground, and they're doing the walk in the background, and everyone's walking by and they're
who's going to
putting
grab
their hand on the table. And yes.
The other thing we should probably just throw in is the term giallo is the Italian word for yellow, which was the color of the covers of the pulpy paperbacks that were coming out in Italy in the 20s, 30s. I believe that's about that time period. And a lot of those served as source material for these films. And then, of course, the Giallo kind of took on a life of its own as a film movement. One of the documentaries on that Arrow Blu-ray we've referenced a couple times, it opens with a film genre is easier to recognize than is to define. And I thought that's very apt for the Giallo because, yeah, sometimes you're like, I don't know what makes this necessarily a Giallo, but I know it's a Giallo.
Yeah, I think also something that our mystery man brought up is that the motives often have to do with greed. But I think another key motive that defines the Giallo genre is like sex and sexuality, especially kind of anxieties about, like in this movie, we see anxieties about like women's presence in the workplace, women's presence in the public sphere in certain kinds of ways. And in this film, the kind of red herring in the kind of inspection scene, once they've all been brought into the police office, they're throwing around speculation about what the motive might be. And someone says perhaps female beauty makes him lose his head and kill. And that's like kind of the red herring, but that's also kind of a defining feature of the Giallo is that there's something about beautiful women that provoke really aggressive kind of responses. And I think that's something that the opening credits are doing as well, is making a direct comparison between the models as something to be looked at and the mannequins as these like inanimate objects that sort of stage perfection for others to purchase. So there's that kind of uncanny doubling there between the inanimacy of the mannequins and the inanimacy of the women, like once they're murdered, but also this kind of like uneasy agency that they're asserting that is threatening.
But this film really is all about beauty and its desecration, definitely. And this film has a lot of facial horror. One of the most extreme facial horror scenes you will see, two of them actually. And it's wonderful because Bava doesn't have to be explicit in that desecration of beauty, because he already defines the beauty, he establishes it, and it is so powerful, the beauty of the visuals, the beauty of the women, the fashion, everything else, that you don't have to do that much to make it shocking, but he does, but he doesn't have to be explicit about it. The film isn't gory at all, but the way it's edited, the way it's shot, and the fact these women are so beautiful, it is shocking that much of this is facial horror. I think that's a big part of the Giallo, and it did escalate, as the Giallo went on, certainly became much more explicit and graphic, but that is, as Nicola pointed out, a big part of Giallo is desecration of beauty. And this film establishes that, certainly.
The one you were just referencing, where a woman has her face pressed up against a hot stove. That stove does not look realistic. It looks like it's, like it's a prop that's been lit up from within, but it serves the purpose because it's that vibrant red color. And we've already seen the damage that it can do on her hand. And then the face starts being pressed slowly closer and closer and closer.
Actually, I think that was the scene that just made me realize, okay, this is not, you could watch this 60 years later, you could watch this 30 years later, you could watch it at that time, and I think you'd still get that same response to that scene where, as you said, we see what it can do when he presses her hand on it. And then it's like, oh no, they're gonna push her face onto it. And when it happens, and it's just, you feel it, and it's just like, oh no.
But he does what other directors hadn't done yet as much. We are having our faces pressed up against it too, because we're getting closer and closer to it, and that really makes it suspenseful and makes you feel the pain.
The other facial trauma is that awful mace that has kind of the three prongs. And in both of these cases, the killer is seemingly taking great pains to let the victim know that this is going to be the end for them. And I think that is kind of indicative of these gialli, is that they are drawn out. They are set pieces.
And I think we also should make a connection between, there's a one shot of the mace coming closer to the face, which is very reminiscent of the opening of Black Sunday, where the mask is being presented and it's being brought forward to the camera and it's about to be put on Barbara Steele's face, and you get sort of this glinting of the firelight, and it's you see these spikes, these are going to hurt when they go in.
Barry, you talked about the sense of humor. I think the fact that the burned body ends up in the boot of the car and it gets driven out into the countryside. It's unexpected comedy to have
the trouble with Harry. Where's the corpse?
Right, like they have to follow after
the corpse. Yeah, exactly.
And then it gets hidden behind the screens, and then somebody else is dragging it away. So it's like we're constantly like tracking, where is this body going to end up? And where it does end up is kind of this artfully posed thing for the inspectors to find.
It is also reminiscent of the one model who's found with the suit of armor on top of her.
We have these pairings, and Nicola, you were saying, the sexuality there, I think, is kind of inherent, but it's also something that doesn't hit you over the head. It is just two bodies, but also it could be something else.
But you'll notice what Bava does with that shot too, that really makes it more terrifying is, yeah, you can have the bodies like that, and you can see the ladies and they're dead, but he has the one lady move her eyes all the way to the left, so you just see the whites of her eyes, so he understands the impact of that, that makes the shot so much more shocking than just if they were lying there dead, and he underlights it, so that emphasizes the whites of the eyes. So he knows exactly where the viewer is going to be looking, and he manipulates that very well.
Well, something also that we should mention is the fact that the Italian title for this is 6 Women for the Killer. So it's kind of like we have our little scorecard where we're kind of counting off how many murders have occurred at this point. I mean, I love the poetic quality of Blood and Black Lace, but I also think there's something to be gained from that 6 Women for the Killer title as well. So we could talk really quick about Cameron Mitchell. He's kind of our big name in the title.
I remember reading in Tim Lucas's book, All the Colors of the Dark, that when he interviewed Cameron Mitchell had nothing but wonderful things to say about working with Mario Bava. I mean, he was used again in Knives of the Avenger. So obviously, Bava and Mitchell worked well together and they had a great relationship. He trusted Bava implicitly to know where to put the camera to make him look as good as possible. And I think it's interesting looking at something like Blood and Black Lace, where he's introduced very early on, and then he disappears for a long time. And then you will come back to him. That same thing happens with the other killer, where she disappears for a long time. And it's finally when you come back to the fashion house and you're like, oh, that's right. These are characters in this movie too, which is like possibly another clue that, hey, maybe they've been doing some other things in these scenes where you haven't seen them before.
Right.
He has a wonderful stillness to him and a kind of a bemused look on his face in that lineup where he knows they don't know who the killer is, which is why we're all here. So all I have to do is use my one phone call to tell my girlfriend, hey, you need to kill somebody so that I have an alibi. That's that kind of thing.
Well, and one of the great things in terms of the camera work is that we see the POV of the killer, which is something that, becomes a hallmark of I'd say the Giallo and the slashers as we move forward. It wasn't the first time that we had POV of, a antagonist, but it certainly is really well used here.
And along those lines about Cameron Mitchell, I met him at a Cinema Wasteland show, and we're talking about Bava, and he was a very personable guy. He was a good guy, and he said that of all the directors he worked with, and he made, he was in over 100 films, varying quality, but he said Mario Bava was the only director, he said, who was so innovative that he would, first of all, his movies were made for nothing. This film in today's dollars cost less than $1 million to make, which is astounding. He said that he would use, like, for example, there was one scene in the film where the camera is dollying through the mannequins, going through the curtains. It's a very long dolly, reveal dolly. He used a wagon for that. That's all they had. He mounted things on a wagon. He made a mount himself on the set, made of some materials they had there, some wood and some other things. He made a mount. He said everywhere they went, he would innovate and figure out ways to get the cameras in the places he wanted. He didn't have anything at his disposal. So he said he was definitely the most innovative and confident filmmaker that he ever worked with. That's saying a lot because he worked with a lot of filmmakers.
That shot you just referenced, it's toward the end of the film, I think is the one you're talking about, where we have this POV kind of drifting through and it bumps into a mannequin and it goes away, heads over this way. And what's great about that shot is that we think that it's shot from Eva Bartok's character's point of view, and it isn't. The camera comes in through the door and then she comes in from the other side. And so if you're thinking about it, you're like, wait, what was that? Just Bava? Were we just following along with Bava as he took us into the room? It's really kind of groundbreaking in that regard, in that it does pretend to be something that it isn't. It's all about this illusion.
And that also brings us to kind of one of my favorite shots in the whole film, where we have Eva Bartok standing there in that weird space with the mirror and the overturned mannequin. And then there's curtains in the background and curtains framing in the foreground. So I'm bringing back our conversation from curtains a little bit, but it's another one of those clear instances of, like, Mario Bava is like, you are watching a movie. Think about the fact that you're watching a movie, and think about what your voyeurism on this, or what your gaze on the events that are happening here does to implicate you in the kinds of dynamics that are happening on screen.
Well, our mystery van commented on the mannequins bearing silent witness. I think we are also bearing silent witness and complicit in that same breath. We have invited ourselves to this party, and we're going to watch, and we know, I mean, it's in the title, there's going to be 6 women killed. And you're like, well, sign me up. Where do I buy my ticket for that? And how does that engage with us as an audience?
There's another shot, which I love, which is when one of the women is called away to the phone, and there's a mannequin right there while she's on the phone. And then while she's talking about where she's going to go and who she's going to see, you see this wonderful shadow appear on the back wall. So you know that not only are we listening, not only is the mannequin listening, but somebody else is hearing this, and you know, okay, she's next. It is one of these wonderful films where you kind of know who the next victim is the moment, like there's something happened, you realize, oh, they're next. It's one of these films where it's predictable in some sense, but then again you have those surprise reveals which point you in the direction of, well, I guess I was misdirected. I thought I knew what was going on, and clearly it was something else.
And there's one murder we haven't discussed. We've had our elements. We were out in the woods getting murdered amongst the dirt and the trees. We've had our hot fire, and then suddenly we get some water introduced.
Yeah, that bathtub scene, and I forget the name of the character in the movie.
Towley.
And just how that was pulled off. It's shot, at least in my view, so beautifully. She's drowned, and then they said, "Oh, well, we need to make it look like it's a suicide." And you have to cut her wrist while she's there in that bathwater, and you're seeing this blood just slowly fill up the bathtub, and she's keeping her eyes open this entire time. If I could pick a standout image of this movie, I think that would be it. I feel like that is probably the most iconic shot of this movie that would draw anybody in, just even somewhat curious about it. And you're like, I wonder how they pulled that off. Let me see this movie and get to it.
Well, and I mentioned earlier how all the victims are kind of aware that their death is coming. She is completely unaware. Like, we are literally plunged into that murder where, her face is being shoved into the water and right at us, and we don't know what's happening. She's also a very striking actress. Claude Daunt is her name, and she has just a very unique quality about her. And so the second we see her face, we know instantly who that is.
I'll add one more fascinating thing about that scene. As Nicola pointed out earlier about the mixing of sexuality and death in the film, when I saw this when I was 12, she's killed in the tub. They have this blue wrap around her, like a blue towel or a blue wrap around her bottom half. And I thought, oh, of course, they can't show anything, so that's going to be there, of course. But then he takes it off.
Right.
And her legs, I thought, wow, that's crazy that they would go that far. I mean, even as a 12-year-old, but even now I see that and I'm like, that's really pretty extreme, actually, and drawing those elements in with her slitting her wrists and the blood and everything like that. That's another thing that Bava did at the time, which I thought was very daring.
Well, and I have to wonder if it is a callback to Hitchcock as well. It's like, okay, you did your shower moment, Alfred. So now you're scared to take a bath as well.
You could also be a little bit of diabolique.
Sure, absolutely. Well, all things lead back to diabolique, I think. Terrific French thriller. If you have not seen that, definitely check that out. A precursor and inspiration for Psycho for Alfred Hitchcock.
Diabolique is a good segue. Talking about the creamy, there's another movie that I think is probably was a direct influence on Bava for Blood and Black Lace. And it's a Swedish movie called Mannequin in Red, directed by Arne Mattsson. That is a very similar setup. It's a murder mystery in a fashion house. It's part of a series of movies with these two married detectives, the Hillmans. Unfortunately, those movies have not gotten like a legit English-friendly release. Mannequin in Red it's in color. It's from 1958. It's very lurid color also, so it feels like a direct influence. I'm not sure how much of one it might be, but if you can track that down, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot goofier than Blood and Black Lace, and it's not nearly as violent, but it's a good time.
One thing that I found interesting about this film is, since we talk about it being sort of this prototypical Giallo film, is that it was almost 6 or 7 years before we got another film where there was the killer sort of used this faceless mask to hide their identity. And after that, for a good 5 years, there's like half a dozen films, maybe 8. End result of that is you get to the lovely duo of Amer and The Strange Color of Your Body's Tears, which clearly take the influences of many Giallo. It sort of takes all these elements and says, okay, we're going to put all of them in this film, and we're going to dispense with the plot, because who needs a plot when you have all these wonderful elements you can play with?
Well, that is a great time to transition to Amer. It is written and directed by Helene Cattet and Bruno Forzani. They are a Belgian husband and wife couple. And as our mystery man intimated, this is very much a tribute to Italian horror and Giallo in particular. I'm not even going to go around. I'm just going to go right to you, Jason, because it was you who introduced me to this film. And I wanted to hear how you kind of came to it in the first place and your general impressions.
I don't remember where I first read about it, but it might have just been I was looking at the program for the European Union Film Festival in 2010 at the Siskel, and I saw it on the schedule and like read up a little bit on it, and it sounded like something I would be interested in. So I went to the Siskel, and it played twice, and both screenings were at awful times. I think they were both like 9:30 or 10 at night, and like one was on like Sunday and the other one was Wednesday or something like that. So I went to the first one and I was, completely blown away, and so I ended up going to the other one also anyway. But yeah, I was very excited to see that, and I'd never seen anything quite like that before. Certainly not at I mean, the European Union Film Festival is usually it's all pretty much straight narrative stuff. And this is just sort of barely narrative, which I'm a fan of that sort of thing. So that's where I first saw it. And so I've been following them very closely ever since.
Barry, would you like to opine?
I thank Jason and you, Doc, in a way, because I watched Amer because I was going to be on this podcast.
Oh, okay.
So I watched it because of that. There's obviously a great eye for composition. There is a great, amount of homage to Mario Bava and Dario Argento. The first sequence really reminded me of A Drop of Water from Black Sabbath with the grandfather.
Yep.
And a little Suspiria thrown in with the Black Witch. I thought that sequence was really effective and really dark and really was leading up to something. But I think as she grew up in the film, the main character who was, tormented and sort of had all this, psychosexual stuff going on about death and all that, it sort of became more repetitious and like something. I was thinking as I was watching it, these images are really fascinating. This beautiful setting, but this maybe should be more of like an exhibit in a gallery, like a photo sequence gallery almost of like these images, because as Jason said, there's no narrative. I'm fine with no narrative. I gravitate towards films like that make you think, actually, and try to draw you in that way. To me, it seemed like many times, much of it was more of an academic exercise, almost like it was for people like us, who want to dissect or deconstruct genres and look at them in that way. But I don't think it was really that watchable in a certain sense. Like I was talking about, the Bava films has this narrative drive with all those visuals and all that style leading to something. I didn't feel like it led to that much, but it is beautiful to look at. I think it was a lot of like maybe a little too much fetishism for me. I'm not as into like these fetishistic images of the lips, that like the angry, lips that were in there for so long. It was a little too much of the lips for me, a little too much of the dead nipples, a little too much of the crotch through the glass, I got it all. And it is great to look at. And I totally understand that. So I can understand why people would appreciate it. I do like a lot of the stylistic things about it. But I think as a movie, it's, again, more academic than something that I would gravitate towards, although I completely understand why people would appreciate it and want to see it and experience it, because it is an experience, definitely.
Let's jump over to Nicola.
As an academic, yes. I watched it also for the first time too.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, got a lot of first time reactions in here, which I think like I would have probably something better to say about it had I seen it more than one time prior to this. But I do think, all of the kind of fetishism that Barry is talking about is working really well in terms of some of the things that we were talking about with Blood and Black Lace, like as an indictment of the gendered politics of looking in Giallo and in film more generally. I think it's asking us really explicitly to consider our role in this like visual scopic regime, and I think it does that super effectively. I think also some shades of like all the colors in the dark appear there too. I really enjoyed watching it. I think the first segment when she's a child, I was having a hard time understanding what I was supposed to do with it. But as the film progressed, I felt like I kind of relaxed into the non-narrative nature of it, and I ended up really enjoying it.
And Chris,
kind of like what Nicola was saying. I did not really know what to expect when I came into it. I had heard of Amer before. It's just one of those ones I never got around to until preparing for this panel. When I finally started watching it and got to that first segment where she's a kid, and I thought it was going one way. I thought it was going to build a narrative, and then it suddenly doesn't. And at least for me, it put me in this kind of like, I find myself, 5-10 minutes later in this section, and I'm just like, wait, how did we get here? What is this? What is the point of this? What's going on? And at the end of it, I did get what was happening. We're watching this girl grow up into adulthood, but it's also taking these sections of Giallo. It is a pure Giallo experience, but it has no narrative to tie anything together. So you are just there, and it's really presented as, I would say, this is something you would see in an art gallery. If somebody were to have a Giallo exhibit in an art gallery, this is the type of movie that I would see in there, where you're experiencing the things that come together, kind of what you were mentioning earlier about what makes a Giallo. And all of those elements are really presented well here in this film. And while it wasn't for me particularly, because I don't really gravitate much towards the artsy avant-garde style of filmmaking, I did appreciate it. And it definitely left a impression on me as far as how it ends and all those segments coming together. And I really just felt like, man, I felt like I watched all the things I love about this subgenre, but at the same time, there is no story present about who a mystery man is. It's just there solely for the experience.
we will definitely circle back around to talk about kind of some of those things you just brought up, Chris. For me, when I watched it the first time, I immediately was like, I need to see this again. Like I feel like as the first experience just washing over you, you're like, I don't know what to make of all this. I think it is a puzzle that presents itself that has a few pieces missing by design, and you are forced to kind of fill that in.
I came to Amer because the local college cinema was doing a midnight screening of The Strange Color of Your Body's Tears. And I read the description and I said, well, that looks fantastic. And I looked it up and found that they had this previous film. So I went to my local video store, which is still going, by the way, very happy to say. And I rented Amer so I could be prepared. I didn't want to go into Strange Color completely cold. Like many of the other panelists, I felt a bit lost in it. I was like, okay, this image is here. I know, well, here's this image again. And oh, here's this image again. If you tried to make a drinking game out of Amer, you would die of alcohol poisoning. It was just because there's just certain fetishistic images that come up, like the blade on the nipples and the close-ups of the lips. And so I felt like, okay, I'm a little prepared now. And when I went to see, so I saw that midnight screening of Strange Color of Your Body's Tears and loved it. I thought this was amazing. And I think having the experience of watching Amer first prepared me for what Strange Color was going to be like. And also, admittedly, Strange Color does have a little bit more plot. There's a little bit more that you can hang on. There's a protagonist that you follow. And a couple years later, I said, well, I should probably go back and rewatch Amer because I love Strange Color so much. And that time when I rented it, it was an edition that had these early short films, like 4 or 5 shorts that they made leading up to Amer, which I think if you watch them in that context, they're sort of teaching you how to watch their films. But each film that they make, it seems like, okay, if you're on board with this, well, how about this? And then we'll add this, and then we get our feature, and then we do another feature. And I think in between was when they did their segment of the ABCs of Death. And that's one where they had only 2 minutes to establish a concept and get the images in there. So very clearly, they had boiled the Giallo to its essence. Watching it for the first time, it can be extremely I wouldn't say off-putting, but it can be alienating. And having those references, you get to experience it a second time, and you understand why they're there more. You may still not love it, you may still not click with it, but you can see why they're there.
Nicola, Chris, and Barry, have you seen Strange Color of Your Body's Tears?
I have not.
That's their follow-up to this one. And
Mhm.
it is, as Mystery Man pointed out, it is much more just about the elements of Giallo, and it's much more specific. Jason, I know you're a big fan of that film as well. Would you like to just make a few comments on Strange Color of Your Body's Tears?
Sure. But first, I was also at that screening, the midnight screening.
Oh my.
It was so loud. That was amazing. It was one of my favorite movie-going experiences. Amer definitely, I think, is required viewing. I mean, watching Strange Color is like just getting shoved in the deep end. Like I can imagine coming to that first and just having absolutely no idea what to make of it. I think it really helps to see Amer and some of their other work first. But yeah, Strange Color takes some of the other iconography that maybe isn't used as much in Amer, and just makes this bizarre labyrinth of references, and like Guy Madden's The Forbidden Room, but it's all Giallo stuff. If that means anything to anybody,
It means something to me.
there you go. If you thought Amer was interesting at all, I would definitely recommend seeking out Strange Color as soon as possible. I think it's similarly impenetrable, I think, by the end, but it is a much and you can definitely tell it's the same creative team behind
Yeah,
both.
kind of what you were saying, Barry, the idea of it being an academic exercise. I think of it as a formalistic exercise, that it is exploring all the elements that make Giallo and just heightening them and, you know, kind of inflating them almost. And that's certainly what Strange Color is that Amer is the very rich appetizer followed by the ridiculously rich entree.
I can see that, and I would agree. I think the obstacle to me is that I went to film school, and this looks a lot like what is done by film students, which is fine. I mean, that's good stuff. There's nothing wrong with it. I think maybe I've experienced too much of that. I think that if you want something that brings out all the elements of Giallo like that, but I think this film is a bridge in a sense, because films now, genre films, tend to be reflections upon reflections upon reflections of a genre almost. And this film is doing that. It's in the middle of that. It's a reflection upon something that's a reflection upon a genre, but it's starting that kind of irony poisoned tone, which sort of turns me off a little bit sometimes, you know, like we know what we're doing. Look what we're doing. It's got some pretense. That's okay. A film that I showed in Chicago at my Euro Horror Shock Festival, which does the same thing in many ways. It has a narrative that people cannot understand, that requires you really to get into the film in a dreamlike fashion, is Aristide Messacessi's or Joe D'Amato's Death Smiles on a Murder. That would be my version of Amer, that I would say is a brilliant film that has that dreamlike quality. It has all these fetishistic images in it, but they can bring them together in a way that I think is more accessible for me, where this, I know they're self-conscious about it. And it's so self-conscious that it makes it difficult for me to access it. It doesn't mean there's not beauty in it. Doesn't mean there's not something aesthetically pleasing about it. And certainly I will see the other film. I definitely see the film. And I appreciate being on a podcast like this because it exposed me to that. I might have never seen it.
Right.
So I'm really glad I saw it, but it's just not something that's as accessible to me, maybe as like a purist of the genre or something, or liking the origins of the genre so much, because it has this transitional irony poison tone that looks like more like a glamour magazine shoot sometime than like Bava's films, or, you know, the film I referenced.
Well, you just mentioned that idea of it being very self-aware, and knowingly so, that it is kind of show-offy and deliberately so. Like this, I think I said to Jason, like, these are some of the most intentional films you've ever seen, where it's like you are so aware of every single choice that filmmaker is making. And something that Jason pointed out is that all of the sound in Amer is Foleyed. There's not a single, live sound capture in that entire film. It is meticulously put together.
Well, and the whole soundtrack is culled from What Had They Done to Your Daughters? The Girl Who Knew Too Much, Case of the Scorpion's Tail, Black Belly the Tarantula. So I'm watching this film and going, wait a minute. And it gives me that Pavlovian cue, like, I haven't seen Black Belly the Tarantula in 20 years. Let me watch that. I haven't, so it's giving me these cues that sort of dissociated from what you're seeing, which is really interesting. But I'd just like to maybe ask you, Doc, or the panel, I think maybe what I can't access in this film, and maybe you can convince me otherwise, or maybe I'm completely wrong, is there's a lack of authenticity to the film, to me, in a sense. I don't know if that's right or if I'm looking at it the wrong way, but that's what I feel when I watch it.
I guess if you could expand more on the inauthentic feel.
Well, like you look at a film like Blood and Black Lace, for example. That's authentically coming from Mario Bava's artistry, the creative artistry, his compulsion to make, like he said, movies are a magician's forge. They allow you to build a story, with your hands, and this and that. And I feel that authenticity coming through when I see that. Like when I watch, even like some people laugh at like a Paul Nash film, I can still feel the authenticity of what he is trying to get across in his heart and in his soul. This film didn't seem to have that soul to me. It did not seem to have that feeling. It was just saying, look at these images. We'll put this music to it, which you'll recognize, which is beautiful music. And we'll put these images in a series, and it will recall something that you really enjoy and love, but it's really not that thing.
Yes.
Understandable?
Yeah. In that aspect, yes. I pretty much agree, except for the last segment where she's fully on adult. And I don't know if I'm allowed to spoil anything. Doc.
Sure, we'll put the spoiler banner up for everybody.
Okay.
All right, Chris is going to spoil it. Here comes. Okay, spoil away.
I would agree with you, at least for those first two segments. Like I said, because it feels like it's starting to try and build something in that first section, as I said. And then right around the midpoint of that section, and then all throughout the second section, is kind of where I agree with you, is it felt like you're showing images just for the sake of showing images to get people to understand what encompasses a Giallo film. And when we get to that third section and it starts coming off more like a real Giallo film, like I was getting visions of films like Torso, like the films of, sorry if I butcher her name, Edgewood Finch, how, especially with how she was dressed, it reminded me solely of her movies. And that big empty mansion, that her house that she's going back into, threw me back to movies like Deep Red, where the character's going through his empty, big, huge mansion looking for parts of a mystery before they're attacked. I'd say that ending sequence is probably the strongest part of the film, and where it really does bring back that authenticity. Where they're like, you've sat through all these images on this music and everything, and then now we're going to give you the semblance of something that's actually resembling a plot going on. And when it gets to that ending and you see that, hey, she's found her attacker and she's stabbing him, and then all of a sudden it just closes in on that eye, like she got shocked by something, and all you see is just her on an autopsy table. And what you can assume is the same killer that's just there violating her on this, what I assume is violating her on this autopsy table. But yeah, that's the only part of I could say that felt authentic to me. But the rest, yeah, I would definitely agree is all experience, all visuals, all sound. And that's all you're supposed to kind of take from it, is what my thought was.
Nicola?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in an interesting position on this panel. I found it very authentic in terms of, like, if it had a narrative, the narrative is about the experience of womanhood and of the trajectory from like a young girl to an adolescent to an adult woman, and sort of the different ways that invites people, like each stages of that invite people to engage with you and look at you. I think, Chris, you mentioned one of the shots of the eyeballs, and that's like one of the most recurring images throughout. And I think it's really a film about the violence of the gaze and the palpable threat of, men looking at you. And so I think, like, in terms of authenticity, that felt real to me. And I think that that's like one of the things that it's doing, that it's commenting back on film more broadly and Giallo more specifically, is like that these films are about beautiful women who are subjected to violent gazes. So I think like that felt authentic to me.
Thank you, Nicola. Barry?
I'm sorry, I just want to make the point, Chris, that you sort of made my point in a way when you're reflecting upon all the things it reminded you of. I thought of all those same things, but then I would think, wow, that film is really great because, or that film's really great because. So it just seemed that everything in the film depended on being an homage to something else. So why aren't we just watching the film that it's an homage to? I don't know, but you know, that was just my personal feeling. And again, not to put the film down in the sense that there's no value to it, there is. And again, I will see the other film, but I just had that feeling, the same feeling.
It is a celebration of, and does that have value in itself? I think back to clip shows like, Terror in the Isles, and I go, yes, it makes me think about this other film, but I'm also appreciative of the filmmaker who manages to kind of distill all that together and provide an experience for me, whether it's pleasurable or just kind of reductive. That's everything put together. Okay, congratulations on getting your editing certificate. But I think that this film, I think, does have a lot to say, and I think it also invites us to lean forward should we so choose, and try and engage with it, try and interpret with it. I think it's deliberately withholding. I think it's deliberately holding back on a narrative to ask you to come forward and be like, what is this filmmaker trying to say? I think that's a great interpretation, Nicola. And I don't know that it's the only interpretation. I think it's, I think there's a lot of stuff in there should we choose to dig.
I mean, I think it's really important to keep in mind that this is a film co-directed by a woman. And I think that there's probably a lot of autobiographical feeling in it because Helene Cattet has internalized so much of the genre, and Bruno Forzani, they are, like you said, they have distilled it. But I don't think that Amer is a giallo itself. I think
Correct.
It is a movie that uses the cinematic language and symbols and iconography of the giallo to tell a completely different kind of story. And I think that is Helene Cattet's, as Nicola mentioned, her experiences of being looked at, and also of there's a narrative here, but you have to put the work in to pick it up. It's like this little girl has this weird experience as a kid where she discovers sexuality. She walks in on her parents having sex while she's running from a monster. And then later we see her as a teenager, and there's, this very explicitly being stared down by these bikers, which if anyone hasn't seen Let the Corpses Tan, their most recent feature, it's basically that scene of the bikers creaking leather for an entire movie. So if you like leather, or if you don't like leather, you might after you watch it. And then the final sequence is her sort of coming to terms with this sexuality and accepting who she is and what that means to her. And so, yeah, I think that Strange Color is more of a giallo. When Amer came out, it was sort of lumped in with other neo giallo, like Francesca, the Onetti brothers stuff,
right?
Deep Sleep. Their films, I feel really are very self-consciously trying to replicate giallo films. We're taking all these things and making a new version of them. They don't use recycled music. They use their own new music. But I don't think that they're doing the same thing as Cattet and Forzani are here.
The connection, I think, and I don't want to spoil anything about Strange Color for anybody who hasn't seen it yet, but I think one thing that Strange Color does wonderfully is it sort of turns the gender stereotypes on its head by making the man in the film the very vulnerable. You sort of get to see him at his most vulnerable point, and the film takes him and basically treats him like a giallo heroine, the one who is chased around, is seen nude or without much clothing, and they're the ones who sort of get acted upon. And I think that's a wonderful reversal of the way that giallo had treated women before, and it's sort of like saying, well, what if it happened to a man? Would it be funny? Would it be exciting then? And that's one of the things about the film which I like a lot.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been a great conversation, as I knew it would. When I looked at the roster for today, I was like, oh, this is going to be fantastic. And you did not disappoint at all. So thank you all so much for chatting about these two exercises in style. Any final thoughts anybody'd like to throw out?
Nicola, as a card-carrying member of the patriarchy, I'm going to have to read your book on horror films. Get my education.
Thank you.
No, I always like to be in this podcast because your insights are excellent. They do like make me reflect upon things, and that's great.
Yeah, I mean, I can say like one more thing I think about the gender dynamics of this film. Like we have all these moments, and you can, keep this in or take it out. But we have all these moments where Anna's experiencing sensuous sensory experiences, like with the wind sort of flapping her skirt. I think like that's a recurring image that I think about a lot. And then there's like that moment of her experiencing that and like maybe taking pleasure in that or like having some sort of like internal reaction to that. And then it's sort of like immediately something that's like subject to scrutiny by the men that populate the film world. So I think there's this like continuous push and pull between like her experience of things and the experience of people watching her experience them. So I thought it was brilliant.
That reminded me that I forgot I wanted to mention that all the way that they added everything together and some of those shots like the wind like blowing like her hair or her clothing around and all the like close-ups and just like quick shots, they feel like, and I think they know each other. They remind me also of Peter Strickland's work. Where it's very like sensory. Strickland does something somewhat similar to what's going on in Amer in The Duke of Burgundy, which is well worth checking out.
But it reminded me of another film while I was watching it, where it gives that same, like, it gives you the elements of this film, but it doesn't really, but there is a narrative with it, but it doesn't really push you or pull you one way or the other. And it's called Barbarian Sound Studio. And
Which is
it takes a lot of those. Yes. And I only saw it about a month or two ago at a local cinema here. And it takes a lot of those same elements of what makes a giallo, what makes a horror film, and it puts it down to its rawest form where it's all sound related, and it gives that to the viewer instead of an engaging narrative or anything like that. But I will say I now understand a little bit more of what it was doing, especially in that second section, because that's where it completely lost me. But now I understand a little bit more as to what they were doing as far as showing the blooming sexuality of our lead lady in this film. So I do appreciate it on that aspect.
Yeah, I do find them to be really intriguing artists. Oftentimes, I will say that I'm done with their films before their films are done with me. but I always appreciate what they're bringing to the table. And I can't believe nobody has mentioned the piece of hair that is stuck in the mouth that I just spent the entire time going, let me just get that out of there. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm looking forward to having you all again on very soon. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.